Zoom recording. Okay, thank you. So there's a lot of things that I want us to talk about this morning. And again, thanks everybody for joining us online. My name is Taylor Clem. I'm the County Extension Director of as well as the Environmental and Community Horticulture Agent with IFAS Extension Nassau County. And with today's program, we want to talk about the history of gardening. So why do we do what we do? Why do things look the way they do? It's a really weird, cool story. And we're just gonna follow a ribbon in time, looking at ancient history. And I'm gonna bring you right up to the point in which we look at how landscaping has influenced, or design has influenced how our landscapes look, how they feel, going all the way back to prehistoric times. And we're gonna end right when we get kind of influences into the United States. But so this is a two-part program. So today we're just going to actually just focus on that ancient times to 1840 period. So, you know, anybody that's online, feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat box. I have that open and we're monitoring, we're recording this so you all can have copies later, and we can send out and just put up online, and as well as you all can holler any questions that you got. So, because I've done this before and you're gonna be thinking, well, what about this, Taylor? What about that, Taylor? It's like, yeah, you're right. There's so many things, but we have an hour to take you through what has taken, like when I was doing this formally in school, this was one whole semester that we're gonna condense down in one very quick hour. So we'll get moving. So why do the things they look the way they do? So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So when you think about gardening history and landscape design, what do you think about? How did it evolve? You can put that in the chat box, or I mean, what are some things that you all think about? Now I'll make sure I repeat everything. Making outside rooms. Yeah. Irrigation. How did irrigation come about? I don't know if I necessarily have that stated in this, but I'll let you know in time when irrigation first started, because I do know that. Colors. What else? What else did I hear? British and French influences. We'll talk about that, but it goes way before the French and the British. Way before. Yeah. Carl. Ego. Yeah. We see a lot of ego early on. So what are some other things? Oh, yeah. Calamity Brown. Yeah, that's funny. So we have Capability Brown. He is somebody that was mentioned in the chat box. We will definitely talk about Capability Brown. Social and religious purposes. That's absolutely right. So those are some that we're seeing up here. Farming and agriculture needs. Yeah. So how far back do you imagine some of these things happening in time? People needed to eat. Way before pilgrims. Way before pilgrims. Yeah. 1100s, we'll go back even further. Farming. Gardens started with that early agrarian society. The minute that we learned how to cultivate food, gardening started at the same exact time. And actually in the history of gardening, I need to move this. So in the history of gardening, we see that the minute we stopped wandering around the planet, we started gardening. We started growing food, but we also started growing flowers, cut flowers for utilitarian purposes, trees, etc., provide shade. So we'll talk a little bit about that history. So that's really good. So periods of landscape design. These are going to be the things that we walk through real quick today. We're going to talk about ancient human history, so earlier than 1000 BC. We're going to talk about the rise and fall of early empires, Europe when it's in chaos, Islamic influences, Renaissance order, and then English landscape design to that 1840. So like I said, we're covering a lot in just 45 minutes. We could spend a month just talking about each one of these little things. So, but anyway, so we'll talk about the ancient human history. So where did that Neolithic empire period, you know, we came into this agrarian society, wanderers become villagers. And that first started within this Mesopotamia area. They're this fertile crescent. So that was like, you know, along the Tigris, Euphrates, as well as the Nile River. That's where these rivers had these really good soils, really wonderful soils. So people learned that we can plant within these amazing soils and we can grow food. And this is kind of where that agrarian society originally was born out of. So, but there's two major regions that we see in this area. There's that Mesopotamia area and the Egypt area. But those three key rivers where we start to see this evolve and born from is that Nile, Euphrates, and Tigris rivers. So I hate these type of slides, but I think this is a cool slide because it's just text. So when we actually look at the history of gardening, we have a poem, a Sumerian poem from 2100 BC, and that talks about gardening. That is our earliest recorded history of gardening. And it says, now today, translated, it wasn't obviously written in English. So it says, now today, throughout the whole world, kings of the land far and wide rejoice at Lord Ninurata. He provided water for the speckled barley, irrigation. We saw irrigation during the Sumerian Empire. He provided water for speckled barley in the cultivated fields. He piled up the harvest of fruits in garden and orchard. Later on, it also says, let its meadows produce herbs for you. Let its slopes produce honey and wine for you. Let its hillsides grow cedars, cypress, juniper, and box for you. Let it make abundant for you ripe fruits as a garden. Isn't that neat? So when this was written in such a way where we're interpreting it as at 2150 BC, gardens were well established. Gardens were well established from the perspective of homes, those individual homes, those individual family groups, those clan groups, as well as we're looking at it from the purpose of power. You know, we're looking at it from the perspective of religion, as well as just we worship a God versus we are a God. And we see that in those two separate areas. We see this in the Babylonians and the Egyptians. The Babylonians, we start to see these developments of these gardens and manipulated landscapes. From the Babylonians, we have what are called the ziggurats. You know why we don't have ziggurats anymore, or they're all faded away? They're made from mud, pretty much. So they just eroded over time. Whereas the pyramids, so the ziggurats or the Babylonians, they were kind of celebrating a god. So a lot of these were built for religious purposes, whereas the Egyptians were like, I am a god type of situation. And those pyramids were built out of stone and rock. So that's why we still see them today. But they were very productive gardens. They were productive gardens in the sense it's like you're living in this arid landscape, yet you have the ability to grow and cultivate food, right? So having the ability to grow and produce these gardens was really a strong symbolic representation of power and authority because of your ability to do so. But nonetheless, it was still a skill that a lot of people were able to have at such a utilitarian level for just basic production. But some of the big things that came out of this is we saw very productive gardens, you know, the hanging gardens of Babylon, around a lot of these just Egyptian areas along the rivers, very productive gardens. And I'll show some examples. Walled gardens. So they're these walled gardens that encircled these temples and these palaces, as well as what we call, this is the rise of pleasure gardens. So when we talk about like in early religious text, you know, whether it be the Garden of Eden, it doesn't matter. You know, when we go back to those original, like the stories of Adam and Eve and stories, it all goes back to these very basic principles that we see in gardening design. And there's more story to that nonetheless, but these are the major influences that we're seeing, because when we look at pleasure gardens, productive gardens, walled gardens, those still occur today in how we're designing and planning our landscapes and gardens. So this is Cinnafer's ancient garden. So we have an understanding of what Cinnafer's garden looks like. This is in ancient Egypt because of what was drawn essentially on the inside of the tomb or crypt that Cinnafer was buried in. And you can see on the right what the updated rendition of it is. But it was a walled garden. It was filled with palms, fruit producing trees, shrubs, Very, very productive. And a really neat thing is you're even seeing that they have water features. They have water features in there where they would keep fowl to be able to grow for productive reasons. But also a lot of these became areas for pleasure. Walk around. You're in these areas that are cool. You know, thinking it's hot outside, we're protected inside. It's a very refreshing area. So, but nonetheless, Cinna was viewed as the overseer of granaries and fields. And this is that example of what Cinna's garden is. And this is one of those things that we study in ancient Egypt. But some of the other major things that we see in ancient times, in ancient Egypt especially, this is Queen Hatshepsut's temple of Luxor. And some of the big things that we see, not just in this one, but a lot of these big tombs and temples in this ancient history is symmetry. Symmetry, rectangular pools, enclosures. So symmetry is the basic form of design elements. So how things are developed, and you create symmetry, it immediately provides order in how we look at landscapes and understand them. So we're seeing strong symmetry occur. Now, obviously, when this was built, it was a little bit more lush, obviously, because what they had on the interior parts of these enclosures where they had palm trees, they had a lot of enclosed pool areas, just like we see in that Cinna's garden image. So this is just what's remaining. But we see this as growing influences in these major empires in the Middle East. This is essentially where that gardening essentially began. The idea of gardening, people growing food, having ornamental plants. But then what ends up happening right after that? In history of time, we start seeing influences of the Greeks, the Romans, because there's a lot of overlap between these empires, these groups. So we start to see these different empires grow. The Greeks, it's a progression of agriculture, a progression of gardening. So we see the Greeks, the Persians, and the Romans having huge major influence on how things start to spread throughout the world with those empires, but then their individual influences that come into that. So looking at the Greeks and the Persians, they relied really heavily on religion in a lot of their designs. So the Greeks had productive gardenings that were predominantly agriculture. They had what we called peristyle courts. So they were essentially enclosed areas, like a courtyard, and on the interior portion of it was like a productive area. And also an example of that in a little bit. But we also had these things we called sacred groves. And sacred groves, essentially, that's where the gods lived in the countryside. There were these wild spaces. So when you think about like those big passive recreation parks, like you think of like Prospect Park, Central Park, those were those spaces, from their perspective, the Greeks and Persians, that's where the gods lived. So, they were very sacred areas, but they were kind of a place that you would go into and explore. If available. Sometimes they were closed off and they're only there for religious purposes, or some would fear actually going into those sacred groves. So the Persians, they really pushed that beyond with just what the Greeks did. They became great gardeners. The Persians were known for really progressing gardening during this period. They had these walled gardens, these paradise gardens, or paradisas is what they were called. Think of Cyrus, you might know like Cyrus the Great. But even at this time, there was this like order that started to form based around religion. Zoroastrian, which is like the oldest religion in the world that's still being practiced, where they have 4 major beliefs that rely on fire, air, earth, and water. Those 4 elements. And guess what we start to see as being represented in gardens at that time? We start to see cross axes. And that is, you have a line of symmetry directly influenced from the early Egyptians. But we start to see these 4 areas where you have 2 lines of symmetry kind of creating a cross. We see that in designs, formal designs, all the way through the Renaissance. We still see it today, but it started as a pretext of religion within the Persian Empire of the fire, air, earth, and water. It's supposed to be very symbolic. So this is the Pasagar. This is Cyrus the Great palace and tomb. And this is just, right now, it's just a couple, if you could look at pictures of it, It's just piles of stone. So this is just archaeological, from the evidence, this is what it's suspected to look like during that time. But same thing, it was an enclosed garden. They had water, they had irrigation that was brought in to help water all the different plants. What ended up happening is this became a very productive space. So they were really pushing ornamental plants, vegetable garden, or growing productive food, agriculture in this area. And I really like this one. This is Thin Garden. A lot of times this is attributed to Islamic gardens, but this is not, because this came out from the Persian Empire, and the Persian and Islam garden styles is different. But this is Thin Garden. And I really like this because look at that image on the left. It's an enclosed garden, has very strong symmetry within it. Look at all the plants growing inside there. I love that image on the left. That looks wonderful, doesn't it? Comfortable. And then what does it look like on the outside of it? Yeah, it's like the context, like shoo, and this is that term, like the paradise gardens, that paradisia, that was used within the Persian culture on how to describe garden design. Is we create this paradise, this garden of paradise that's enclosed, that helps protect us from the wilds of what's occurring outside of these walls. And that's important, having these walls that help protect us from the wilds of what's happening outside. So, this garden specifically was more for recreation too, which is really cool. But now let's jump to the Romans. So the Romans, they took a lot of influence from the Persians, the Egyptians. They took a lot of influence from the Greeks especially. But as growth occurred, Romans sought for peace, calm, and tranquility. There was a lot of just, I think a lot of chaos that's always happening and fighting at different empires and groups. They were looking, they too fought a lot, but they were looking for, how can we use these spaces to be calm, peaceful, tranquility, allow them to be a place for us to rest. Sound familiar? Why do you all have gardens? Is it a place to rest? It depends. It depends on how many invasive species you have, right? Yeah. So, but anyways, so that's where gardening took kind of like a different type of turn, is they can be productive, but do they have to be fully productive? Can they just be a place for us to rest? So, in the Roman Empire, they took this idea of this Peristyle Court that existed within the Greeks and the Egyptian influences, and they created, here's this layout. Part of their homes, they had these interior courtyards that were completely open. These were these Peristyle courtyards. Depending on how it was laid out or the structure of it, you had this thing called the xystus. So the xystus overlooked the garden. So it's almost like, imagine it's the Romeo and Juliet moment. You come out on the balcony that overlooks this court. And then you have the ambulation. So the ambulation is the actual garden space itself. It's what's happening that's open, exposed to the elements. But then they have that gestation, which is that place that occurred around the ambulation that was open aired, but it's just like you just had a roof over your head. You have the columns, so you can walk around the garden, you're outside, but you're protected from the elements. So that was kind of like an area where you move around. And a lot of these were very private, that you see them just in villas or big palaces. Sometimes you'll see them in some public spaces, but not very much. But those are the two types of garden areas that we see in the Romans, is you have these villas and these public spaces, but the villas were also some of the most influential places that we start to see some of those designs. So this is House of Vette. It's in Pompeii. We know what happened there. But here's a reconstruction of it. Of course. So it doesn't necessarily have that xystus, that overlook, because it's just a single story building. Usually larger palaces that had these peristyle courts, they would have that second floor that you can look out over. But you can see there's nothing really being productive in there. It's purely garden. It's a lot of annuals. They'll probably have some herbs, but it's just like, yeah, we're growing food. We have agriculture happening. We don't need to think about sustenance for ourselves because so this is just pure hangout, enjoy, entertainment, relaxation. And you can see that ambulation or that gestation that's happening around the courtyard as well. Starting to see, I was like, oh man, we see that now. We see that in a lot of designs now, and how gardening is using and how it's structure and order or just influences per se. So this is a huge part of that Roman Empire, but we also start seeing, that, like I mentioned, that increase in horticulture or ornamental horticulture. Not all plants had to be productive anymore. So we're just purely focusing on maybe the aesthetic. But we also saw a lot more outdoor kitchens. We started to see they became spaces for entertainment. They became spaces that were extensions of the home. Used to be your home, productive area. Now, with this influence from the Roman world, it's like they're one and the same. Your home and your garden and entertainment space, they are the same thing. They're not separate items, entities anymore. So, which is a really neat thing. And this is Emperor Hadrian's Villa, Hadrian's Wall in England. This is that emperor. But this is Villa Adriani, which is in Tivoli. So you can actually go onto their website and have a really cool virtual tour that you can click and tour the entire gardens of the villa. Has anybody ever been there? I haven't. I would like to go. So, but anyway, so that's Roman influences. But what happened with the Romans? Whoops, thumbs down. Rome fell. So we had these two areas. We had Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. So Eastern Roman Empire fell and Europe went in pure chaos. Western Roman Empire was still around until Istanbul was once Constantinople, So, but anyway, so when I think I had it backwards just then. When Western Rome, I did have it back. I'm sorry. When Western Roman Empire fell, Europe went into chaos. It went pure chaos because all of a sudden, the authority that was essentially over all the land was gone. So what was happening? Resource availability. Where were we getting our food from? Who was in authority? Who was in power? People started fighting and battling. So all of a sudden we're in this area where we call it Europe in chaos. These are the dark ages. And all of a sudden our gardens started changing. All right. So we'll see how those influences existed, but how then it changed over time. So we started seeing mass migrations throughout Europe during this period. There's resource uncertainty. There was wilds beyond the wall. If I was not protected, I was vulnerable to whatever is outside, whether it be thieves, whether it be the wild, you name it, vulnerability. So what did we start to see a lot more of in this period? Walls. Like you think of like these European castles, those Dark Ages castles, I always think of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the French guys looking down on them, So, so we start to see there's wilds beyond the walls. There's rise in feudalism. There's these power grabs. It's like, okay, who's in charge now? So bam, bam, bam. So there's a lot of stuff happening. So we start to see these things that we call like these medieval cloister gardens. They are part of churches. They're part of the surrounding buildings associated with churches, which were typically a part of those big enclosures, but they were very utilitarian. And this is a great example. This is Mount Saint Michael in France. This is really cool because it's literally just like sitting out in the water. Talk about a fortification, right? You want separation. It's like, there's a lot of stuff going outside. Let's build, we'll have this, but let's hang out in the water a little bit. So all of a sudden, but like, this is what we're seeing, typical of some of those cloister gardens. Now, this is different slightly than what those cloister gardens originally were. But this is what we're looking at. What are you seeing? Looks very Roman, doesn't it? You got this Peristyle Court, this courtyard. So you have this open green space. You have this garden within this wall. With these enclosed walls, you can walk around, but they have a bunch of different buildings attached to it, typically, like I mentioned, associated with churches at this time. They're all part of those fortifications. But you see how there's the shrubs and the plants that are all within that area? that wasn't accurate to the time. This is when we start to see the rise of turf grass. In these periods, original gardens within these cloisters, this is St. Augustine's Abbey, it was maintained by either livestock or it was maintained by people with scythe, going out and cutting the grass. Low maintenance. This is what was existing within those original cloisters. This is the most accurate representation of a cloister garden during that early medieval period. So of course they change and evolve. This is more of a representation of the later medieval period when feudalism was well established. There's a lot more authority and control. So you see this change a little bit. But typically what's happening is this is becoming a low maintained area, not just within the cloisters, but outside those protected areas as well. Why do we want to make sure that outside, like those walls or those castles or whatever that might be, why do we want to keep it open and low? See anyone coming? Yeah, it's purely maintained to help see like who's coming. So there's a big clear buffer between built and wild so people can see what's coming. So it was more for a way of just visual perception and safety as well. Yes. Yeah. It's purely defense. It's like, I can see where they're coming. If you're coming, I can take care of you before you can get to me. That's purely what it is. It's purely defense related. So they would have that low grass, they would have livestock sometimes outside of it helping keep that grass low. And if there's like a siege, they bring everything inside and they move them to these cloisters. So, but that was when early medieval areas. So we're seeing that example of where that enclosed interior garden is still moving, but it's a little way more utilitarian than it was with the Romans. But we start to see that upper middle age area, and we start to see some big changes. So this is in the Netherlands. So all of a sudden it's like, okay, it's a little bit more established during this period. We're not in the Renaissance by all means. Still rise of that feudalism, or that feudalism still occurring, but we're starting to see more ornamental designs occur within those cloisters. So this is Pandoff Garden in the Netherlands. And this garden has changed over time because this is its most latest type of design as part of that upper medieval Dark Ages area. But it too was just a low cloister garden, but has a slightly different architecture style. So it means it was a little bit later in that period anyways when it was built. But anyways, so we're seeing how this is changing. And as part of this, we're seeing a lot of growing of herbs and within the garden, some more productive growing, because at the same time, this is associated with the churches, this is associated with monks, it's associated with healing. So there's a lot of medicinal plants that are being grown within these gardens as well. So then we come and you see the Fen Garden again, but then we start to see some Islamic influences that are occurring because the Islamic influences start to spread throughout all like North Africa, parts of Europe, the whole Middle East area. We start to see booming Islamic growth during this time, and so as their garden influences as well. So they were heavily influenced by the Greeks and the Persians. Their Islamic, like I mentioned, they spread through the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, India, and it kind of turned into what we refer to as Moorish gardens in some parts of those areas, like in Spain. So they had a big influence from the Persians, but they had that Chahar Bagh, which is the 4 gardens of paradise. So rather than the earth, I can't remember the 4 other earth, where, wind, and fire. Yeah, there we go. So, but now we have these 4 gardens of paradise from the Quran containing 4 rivers. And in the Quran, it says the gardens beneath which rivers flow. So they're literally designing their gardens heavily influenced from the Persian, but theirs is within the religious script of what we're seeing from Paradise Gardens. And the same thing when you look in a lot of the religious texts, it kind of has that same exact description from where rivers flow. That's a lot of it's talking about the Tigris and Euphrates. But anyways, so it's to help protect from the harsh environment. So here's some good examples. Madrash-i Shaharbagh. This is a paradise garden that's in Iran. And water. Water is important. Do we have AC and air conditioning at this time? No. Was it hot? Yeah. So we have a lot of trees that help provide shade. But a really cool thing that we start to see in these Islamic gardens is moving water, not just pools of water, but moving water, just thin little bits of water that are moving over textured like substance. Like it could be gravel, but it could be sometimes just stone that has a lot of chiseling done to it. I can't remember what that's called all of a sudden, but it creates that sound of moving water. And you know what that does? Mentally cools you down. So that was their way of cooling you down, is just purely psychological. So yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So they're clearly keeping it a defined edge around it in some cases to kind of deter wildlife from coming in, like snakes, cobras in the Middle East, especially India. And also another cool little trick that they have with this, these suckers might only be like 8 inches deep, 12 inches deep, purely stone on the interior. And you'll start to see, I think you see it in Islamic gardens, is as early as we see it, but they'll start to paint it or dye that stone black, because then you can't see the bottom of it. So you can't actually see its depth, which is kind of a neat little trick. And we still do that in design. It's like, oh yeah, here's like a 4-inch pool. I'll paint it black. You'll see it. And it's like, ah, that could be 100 feet deep. So that's a good point. Here's an Alhambra. That's where we start to see some really cool influence of Islamic gardens. That Moorish style garden, peristyle type court, right? Enclosed courtyard, you have that water, you can walk around it, but it's purely ornamental, nothing, purely to be able to walk and stroll. But that also has high ornamental value and some of the same, again, this is at Alhambra. You're starting to see a lot of that sound of water, use of fountains, cool people down as they're using the gardens and walking around the gardens. Of course, this looks to me more comfortable than this, but but that's a matter of perception. But this is at the Alhambra, so they actually have a lot of really cool influences on that Islamic garden style there. But here's another. Here's a tomb. This is in India. But this is, we start to see in this Islamic garden, you know, we start to see not just that cross axes, but we start to see major grid patterns occur as well. And it's just, look how it's a very formal garden, very, very formal garden. You're having that water kind of move around. You have trees, very strong geometries. And that's having a major influence within those Islamic gardens. But again, that's coming from that strong symmetry that's occurring from that early Egyptian era. You're seeing that that cross symmetry that starts to occur during the Persian Empire. But then, you know, the Islamics will take it and they grew it a little bit more, and you start to get these really strong grid patterns. So, and in some of these as well, the main focus starts becoming the central or focal point of the entire landscape, rather than maybe being anchored at one end. So all of a sudden that whole landscape around that building is becoming the anchor to that entire garden. So we're in this whirlwind, of course. So we went through the ancient Egypt, the Mesopotamia area. We talked about the rise and fall, like the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Islamic influences, you know, that Europe in chaos. But then Europe started to get a little bit more creative, and we started to fall into this Renaissance order, is what we called it. So this Renaissance order, that Renaissance period, it began in Italy. And it was predominantly brought on by the Medici family. It's kind of like where it originally started. But anyway, so it began in Italy. Merchants, or the Medicis, that family were merchants, were influenced by Islamic gardens and stories from soldiers that were coming in from Constantinople at that time. So during this time, they actually had like a rediscovery or this Enlightenment type of period, talking about classical philosophy, literature, and art throughout Europe. So that sounds very Renaissance period, right? So gardens turned outwards. So all of a sudden we have these enclosed spaces. It's like, hey, we have better control of what's going on right now. Let's turn it outwards a little bit more. So gardens turned outward from cloisters. There's a precedent of order. So how do we have strong order and harmony and aesthetics where art tamed or controlled nature? So this is a very like high period of dominance over nature is what ended up happening within this Renaissance era. And this ended up happening throughout Europe, Asia, Western Asia, like in Russia area. We started seeing this spreading of this Renaissance order in gardens and design. And like, here's a great example. This is Babylonian Gardens in Florence, Italy, but you can see it has a really strong symmetry to it. It's very formal. Every part of it, they want to kind of see that it's maintained and controlled because we have control over art, or sorry, the art helps control over that nature. So some of the things that we started to see in this Renaissance order is what we call balance and symmetry. So we're seeing the strong symmetry, but the balance becomes like can be visual balance. So we're thinking of these landscapes as being more of think of a portrait. They are art in themselves. So they have, I mean, if you think about all like different, why does art look good? It has good framing, has good visual weight, has good color, has good texture. You know, there's what's the theme, what's the feel, the mood, etc. It's not just the art that we're seeing, but it's seeing that whole experience happen within how we're planning and designing our landscapes. So water becomes a very dynamic part of these designs as well, which we still use now when we have fountains in our yards, fountains within our landscapes or those planned areas that we have. We start to see high use of statutory and ornament features within the garden. And a lot of it, and it's including topiary, and there's a lot of influence at this period as well from the Romans and the Greeks. So there were 3 periods of the Renaissance. There's the low, high, and Mannerist, but we're not going to get into those per se. But this is Villa Medici. Villa Medici, this is kind of one of the original thought to be where like that whole Renaissance period came about because the Medici family were merchants and they loved hearing about all these things. And they would actually invite people to these parties. They loved designing these big buildings and villas. And they would invite people over and it's like, let's talk, let's explore philosophy and art. And that's kind of like the idea of where this Renaissance kind of started to emerge from. But we see a lot of these start to occur on the exterior outside of these cities. Why do you think we start to see that? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So yeah, so you know, within the gardens, they would have different types of seasonal elements to those gardens that could change. But we start to see these big villas. Are these big villas within these dense urban areas, or are they on the exterior? They're on the exterior. There's more space, but a lot of it is just because at this time, when you think there's a lot of people, it's not urban areas, were not healthy areas. So this became a way to escape what might be, you know, the disease, or, you know, before the Renaissance, you think about the plague. So you start to see wealth start to mass land. And this is where you start to see some of these villas because they're viewed as cleaner at this time. So some of the other things that we'll see with Renaissance order, this is Villadeste. Again, this is in Tivoli, Italy. This is actually the palace of a cardinal. It was part of the Catholic Church at this time. Yeah, talk about nice, right? So this is a beautiful garden, but you can definitely see this is all enclosed still, but there's still a lot of structure and order, strong geometries, axes, the symmetry. There's a lot of use of water. And one of the really neat things is there's a lot of fountains that are used in this design. So it's like, man, how do they do all this stuff when there's no electricity or pumps and all that stuff. But it's just really cool when you look. There's one of the features, I don't know if I have it on this design, but in this image, there's one feature in this garden called, it's a water organ. So it's really, really famous. But essentially it's an organ that is played that relates to the fountain in itself. And it's using just water pressure and dynamics. And it's kind of, they all interact with one another. So it's a really, really cool thing. And it's this right here. That's the water organ. I'll draw it on the screen so y'all can see it. Whoop. So clear, go away. Okay. So this is Villadeste. So it's and part of this design that was really known, famous, is, again, it does what these things we have are called borrowed views. So it's enclosed, but you're using what's outside of the garden as well to become part of that garden in itself. But also there's these different grottos. So the grottos became influenced from the Greeks. And they are kind of like these little hidden pocket areas that you're seeing in some of these gardens. So this example on the right, that is a grotto, and there's multiple grottos hidden throughout the Villadeste. And there's a little statue, you see his face poking out, looks like he has a big green beard. So this is what's happening in Italy. So that's where kind of like the Renaissance started coming, but then we start to see kind of that spread a little bit to French gardens, and there started becoming more influence in the French, and there's French high order gardens as well that kind of came from that Renaissance. But ended up happening is King Charles is in Italy, is like, hey, this is really cool. I really like this. So he brought it back to France, and this is kind of like viewed as one of the original, the first French Renaissance gardens, which is just his royal chateau. And he had artists and artisans come in from Italy to help build and design this residence for him. So that's how we start to see that influence come into those French gardens. But then we also see that happen within England as well. And that kind of became the birth of the Tudor Gardens, because you had these spaces where you're like overlapping essentially these old medieval type of castles, but you're bringing in these formal Renaissance type of gardens associated with them. So this is Kenilworth Castle. So we're seeing this influence grow. This is Hampton Court. This is in London. Strong symmetries, we can see use of water, very high ornamental. You'd love to maintain that, wouldn't you? No. But again, this is showing dominance over nature, control over nature, which is a very important, strong component of Renaissance gardens. This is Vaux-le-Vicomte. This is designed by a guy named André Lenotre. These French Renaissance gardens, they become what we call French formal garden design. So it's like you're fully integrating that chateau into that garden together. And we start to see some really, really, really major fancy things like Versailles, Palace of Versailles. That is one of those French formal gardens that were strongly influenced, but it's kind of looking at, here's these Renaissance gardens, how do we push it a little bit further? But so we had all this change in the Renaissance. We're like, everything's wild. It's like, okay, we have control now. Let's take control over nature. Let's turn it into art. It becomes this very haves and haves not type of garden design. But then you had this guy in England. His name was William Kent. Cool guy. Traditionally we looked at gardens, viewed landscapes as wild. Gardens, the Renaissance gardens, they controlled and dominated nature. You know what this guy said? William Kent, he says, nature abhors straight lines, hates them. Man. Yeah, he's like, what's the purpose of this? Meh, he hated it. He's like, y'all are crazy. Y'all are nuts. So he created this informal English garden. And I kind of liked it because it was kind of like the gardener's middle finger to everything that's been happening for the thousands of years. He's like, let's do something completely different. So he's introduced this informal garden design. Everything was very strong structure. Very, very formal, straight lines, control, very rigid. He's like, yeah, let's do something a little more fun. He brought in, let's bring in lakes, rolling hills, ruins, not real ruins, tree stands, bridges, meandering trails, hidden architecture. Go explore the wild. Don't be afraid of it, So every view, though, from his perspective was, you stop somewhere in the garden, that's a piece of art. You stop what you're looking at, that's a piece of art. This was kind of like that rise in art. We'll see these pastoral landscapes, where you look at in art history, these pastoral and agrarian societies where it's just like green. It's beautiful. You know, it starts changing. It has a huge influence in art. And William Kent, he's like, yeah, we can do this too. So this is Chiswick House Garden. So this is one of his famous gardens that he did. And you can definitely see that's not formal, but that was very clearly designed. It may look natural, but pretty much every tree, every shrub, every curve, every line was meticulously planned. It's not like, here's a natural area, I'm just going to carve this out, carve that out, we'll put it here, you know. No, there was still really high order and maintenance and construction of these spaces. Here's another one, Claremont Landscape Garden. That was all planned. You know, they literally dig out big lakes. Sometimes they'll use existing ones or expand on them. A lot of times they do some things like draining wetlands. So just because it looks nice doesn't mean it was nice. So this is another example. This is wildly different from the Renaissance garden, right? We're seeing this type of, you're starting to see how it's like, oh, we see this in park design, we see this in garden design, but you're also seeing how structure and order is also impacting our gardens and landscape design. But then we have this guy, Lancelot Capability Brown. He actually studied under William Kent. And Capability Brown is, well, to put it short, one of the most influential designers for English design, and then how he changed and influenced the world. He celebrated nature. He celebrated nature. He created these vast views, very similar to William Kent. You could tell he worked with him. He planned for evolving landscapes. How do landscapes change? It's not a static. Landscapes are dynamic and change. So he started bringing that into his plans and his designs. So he created multifunctional gardens. It's like gardens can be for livestock and agriculture. Why can't they be combined? What's a huge thing that we're starting to see more and more now with a lot of our homes? You know, we talk about the Florida-friendly landscaping program, edible landscapes. How can you bring edible productive plants into these gardens as well? Because why not? You know, so you start to think with Capability Brown, people would say, well, what's planned? What's natural? He would keep some of it. He would manipulate some, but you can't tell the difference. I don't know. He had the ability to design in such a way where when it was done and planted and all finished, you can't tell what was manipulated and what was natural, what was already there. So he did about 150 gardens in Britain during this period. 150 gardens. Shoo. But here's an example. Y'all like Downton Abbey? Boink. That was him. So this is Highclere Castle. So you can see obviously the architecture, the building in itself. You can see that hill in the background, but see that architecture up on the hill in the background. That was planned as part of that view to kind of let your eye explore, encourage you to go explore and wander and walk and try to meander through and see what you can find. But you can definitely see that around that is a lot of open space. But there's trees. It's used for agriculture. It could be used for livestock. That's Highclere Castle. This is Harewood House. So I had these very formal gardens right around the house, but then it just disappeared into this natural area. Now, I could jump forward really quick and I can talk about how a lot of early American colonial gardens were this same exact style. Structure, Renaissance structure and order, dissipating into a natural landscape. So that's what ended up happening in early American gardens. But that's important to note. This is Harewood House. And as we come along, we start to see that these English landscape designers, Capability Brown, William Kent, really set a new standard coming out of the Renaissance. So all of a sudden, we did a completely 180 on how we're planning and designing our landscapes in our gardens. And you know who these two guys influenced the most? Frederick Law Olmsted. Frederick Law Olmsted, he went and he was like, actually, Frederick Law Olmsted was actually very depressed in his early life. Very, very depressed. There's actually a letter that you can read where he's contemplating suicide. He's writing to his friend and he's like, I have nothing that I can give to society. There's nothing I can do. He went on a trip, saw these landscapes, and the rest was history. So Frederick Law Olmsted, considered one of the founding fathers of American landscape architecture and design, created things like Prospect Park, Central Park, designed the first planned unit development really in Chicago. You know, he is one of the most influential designers in the world when it comes to landscape design. And then that is where we'll end our story for today for that design history. So we can definitely see there was a linear thread that kind of wound us to where we're at today, and that's at that 1840 period when we start to see some of those beginning and more expansive use of colonial gardens and early American gardens, and how we then have our cool little influences in that next part of the story. So we did a whirlwind. We're now open for questions. Oh yeah, so definitely those English landscapes, even though they're changing how it's done, they are definitely foregoing a lot of that productive in some capacity because it doesn't matter. You know, it's like, I'm so wealthy, people are doing it for me. This is my land. I do have maybe portions of it that are so large, portions of it might be used for agriculture, but other people are maintaining that and managing it for me. And then I get the cut, you know? So, you know, those big wealthy landowners in the 1800 in England, but yeah, it's like they have such large land. It's like, yeah, other people do it for us. So this purely becomes, I'm flaunting my wealth at the same time. So yeah, good point. So what was the most, have you heard this story before? Parts of it. So, you know, what we did is we just cruised through the most basic stuff for this. You know, we didn't even talk about the influence of Asian gardens that we have, but that's a whole other thing in itself. You know, I can spend like 4 hours just talking about Japanese gardens, which is really cool. But anyways, so our gardens and our landscape design, we're not necessarily coming up with anything new. We're just addressing a lot of social needs with what we've already been doing for thousands and thousands of years. It just may change slightly based off of where we might be living at that time. So, but it's really cool when you start to think about, it's like how we're designing things. This goes back, you know, early agrarian society when we're just learning how to farm. We're having those same exact influences now, you know, and then along the way, we picked up some new secrets. So, all right. Any other questions? Oh, I have one here. Oh, thank you. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, where we start to see where these, when we look at like in Egypt, when there is no water available, when we start to see is a lot of these big temples and buildings are right along the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile. It's like the Valley of the Gods, you know, that's literally tombs just all up the Nile River for, but that's, they would dig big trenches and they would have irrigation come in. Yeah. 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 So, mm-hmm. Yeah. So that, uh, so you're see it's unique because when we start to see is there's different ways in which we manipulate the land like based off that availability. So yeah, water was scarcely available, you know, but they that's how that irrigation came out as a rise because of need compared to how it was very abundant, more so abundant with those natural features like ponds, lakes, and streams in Europe at that time. Yes. So someone put on here, yeah, the Cummer Gardens in Jax was designed by Frederick Olmsted's sons. So they had, the Olmsted brothers had a big landscape architecture firm based out of Louisville, Kentucky. So in Olmsted's later life, he ended up in Kentucky. And his sons had a big, I think it was Louisville, but their sons had a big design firm there. And then they did a lot of designs like Cummer Museum in Jacksonville. So they weren't as influential, but they did a lot of really cool things that are very prominent that we can see. Can HOAs prevent us from growing vegetables in our front yards? Yes, but it's easy to get away with. So treat them as annuals and perennials, and they won't know. They're just my annuals and perennials. I just happen to get to harvest them, because that's a cool thing about the vegetable gardens that we're starting to see in these more of this rise of this edible landscapes, because we have much smaller yards, but people still want to be productive. Is, I mean, we've seen the beautiful types of kales and leafy greens that we can grow. Why not throw them in our landscapes? Because they have high ornamental value. I mean, you all have seen what the flower of an onion blooming looks like. You know, replace your agapanthus with, you know, replace your bulbine with chives, or, you know, so technically, yes, they can. But if you're using your existing landscape beds and you just treat them as annuals and perennials, I don't see why not. So, and then half the time they can't tell anyways. So they can tell you to rip it out. It's like, okay, let me harvest everything first, and then I'll take them out. And then I'll plant watermelon. I just imagine, just because it goes everywhere. You told me to take it out, I put something else in. So yeah, technically they can, but I haven't heard of it being a major issue. So some HOAs may have really strict rules, but honestly, if you treat them as annuals, perennials, because you can plant annuals in your landscapes around a lot of HOAs anyways, where it's homeowner controlled, then I don't see why you wouldn't be able to. All right, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for joining us online. And again, everybody, I have this all recorded. So I'll send everybody out a link of this and the follow-up survey I do with everything. So thank you all so much.